Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about line of sight blocking terrain, specifically for desert themes. Now this was a request on one of my lives over on TikTok, so thank you very much to the gentleman who suggested that. Now we are building this to block line of sight for an Imperial Knight. Now it's important to keep in mind my Imperial Knight is about an inch taller than a normal Imperial Knight. So this is going to be more than enough to cover the average knight, as well as it should be more than enough to block line of sight for a Castellan. So, without further ado, let's move on with today's video. Now let's take a second to talk about line of sight and how to identify it. Now, normally in wargaming, when it comes to line of sight, this could be affected by different sized covers. Now for today's example, and what I'm going to talk about here, is total line of sight coverage, meaning that if you were to get down eye level with your miniature, and if you struggle with that, you may want to use something like your smartphone to take a photo or a video so that you can see better where your miniatures may be at, so that you can get a better understanding of what they can see and what they can shoot at. So line of sight is essentially what your miniature could see if it was alive, and who it could open fire on or cast a spell at, or whatever the case may be, depending upon the game that you're playing. First things first, we're going to need to get ourselves some styrofoam. Now I like using the construction type. That's just because it's a little easier for me to use and it's easier for me to get in bulk. Now we're also going to need some way of cutting that styrofoam. Now you could use a hobby knife if that's all you have, but if you can afford to get some kind of electric foam cutter, I recommend doing so. The one I showed is the one I recommend. And then you're also going to need a styrofoam cup, because it's a great way to take up a lot of space in a large project, especially if it's not going to get seen at the end. Now real quick, I am going to show you the quick and easy way to do this. Now this is just a way to kind of slap things out if you're not really sure if you want to take the time to do it the other way. We're going to go ahead and take our miniature and we're going to mark out how big we want the top to be. Now we want the top to be the same size as the base for two reasons. Number one, the miniature can stand on it if we want it to, but number two, if the top is the same size as the base, we know that it's going to completely block out line of sight. Now as you can see, I'm just kind of rough running this wire through the foam. Anytime I need to, I just take a big old chunk off and then I keep going back at it. Now I'm just kind of cutting these patterns haphazardly, and that's fine. That's going to make things look a lot more natural when we go to paint everything later. Now once you get your first disc all cut out, go ahead and take a hot glue gun, and we're just going to smear some glue on the bottom and then stick it down into the corner of our big remaining sheet. This is going to be the start of our next layer. We're essentially working from the top down, and that'll create a base as large as we want to. In this case, I think I go down about 5 layers. Now you can quickly see by doing this how much material I'm actually going through, and you can imagine that although a large sheet of foam, a full-size sheet of foam, may get you half a table's worth of terrain, you'll see that by doing it the other way, you could get a couple of tables worth of terrain and still have styrofoam left over to build some buildings. Now here I'm just showing off one of the other accessories. This is a cutting stick, as it's labeled in the instructions. Basically it's just a stick that gets hot that allows you to cut through styrofoam. Now the one downside to this is styrofoam goo does stick to it, and you end up having to clean it off with a paper towel. If you don't clean it off, it will actually melt into the styrofoam and will leave little pock marks that we'll have to clean up later. I can talk about that more toward the end when we start to clean up the other model. Now as you can see, we're basically just going to rinse and repeat this. We're going to keep adding more layers and cutting out more layers until we get enough height that we can no longer see our dreadnought behind it when we compare the height of our plinth versus the height of our dreadnought. Now, like I point out in that previous video, doing something like this is going to take up a lot of material. Now, you could cut out a hollow spot underneath, but that material is still wasted. Even if you're building some huge large dome and you think I'm going to cut a section out and get 2 domes out of it, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But let's talk about a better way that, in my opinion, also looks a little bit nicer than this. It also takes up less material, and it allows you to upcycle things like old styrofoam cups that you might normally just throw away. Now, as you can see, the reason I use a styrofoam cup is it's already just a tiny bit larger than an Imperial Knight is on its own. So assuming you haven't added some huge thing off the top of your Knight, styrofoam cup from either Wendy's, McDonald's, wherever, in this case Chick-fil-A, they're gonna be about the right size you need to make sure that your terrain ends up at the right height. Now what we want to do, just like we did before, I'm going to go ahead and mark out where our base is with the cup here. And I'm just using a Sharpie, and then we're going to rough cut out the shape of our base. Now in this case, I don't want the foam to follow the curvature of the cup. I want to have a bit more than just a cylinder shape. So we're going to kind of go for this teardrop shape. And I'm going to cut things out just like I did with that first layer of foam in the previous project. Now I'm not following my squiggly line exactly. That squiggly line is just a good idea for me to keep in mind where the edge of my project is. Now I'm also not cutting vertically. I'm actually cutting at about a 15-degree angle, meaning that the back side of my foam is slightly larger than the top side of the foam, if that makes sense. So we're tapering to a tighter point as we go up. Now you will reverse direction every now and again with this method, and in my opinion that gives us some more natural small plateaus as we go up. Once I got the base all cut out, I want to go ahead and secure on a little strip of foam to the side of the cup. Again, this is going to help us to build up that teardrop shape without using tons of material. And so basically we're just creating some scaffolding that we can then glue strips of styrofoam down to. Now there is a trick to making the strips of styrofoam look more like rock. Starting with the edge of a piece of styrofoam, you could use any scrap you want, or you could use a brand new piece. We're just gonna cut a strip of styrofoam off. You can see I'm actually keeping this really close to the edge, and I'm just doing a scraggly edge all the way down. You'll notice I'm not trying to match any kind of curvature of the cup or anything like that. We're just keeping the styrofoam in these nice thin strips. And then the trick is making sure that we kind of keep things relatively flat. We don't want any like really big chunks, so that's why you can see me snipping off little pieces that are sticking out a bit too far. My next step is to then go ahead and cut off the next strip that will be used for creating our rock face. We've already gone ahead and given ourselves a nice jagged edge. Now let's go ahead and cut a smooth back to this jagged edge. So our smooth back is what we're going to be gluing to. That flat surface is going to be really great to gluing to the side of the cup and to that little support rod that we added on there. So basically every time we do a cut with our hot wire cutter, we're then coming back in and using our X-Acto knife to then cut the next stripe, and that gives us a nice flat edge to go ahead and do our next set on. And we're just going to keep doing this over and over and over again until we have probably about 25 or 30 strips of styrofoam, and then we're going to start gluing things on. As we get closer and closer to the top, we're going to want to work with smaller and smaller pieces, as that's going to allow us to make tighter and tighter curves as we get closer to the top. But for now, having these nice big strips is really nice for working down around the bottom. And as you can see, they actually flex quite a lot before they even snap. So this is going to be really great for gluing onto round surfaces like our styrofoam cup. So I'm not really choosing where I attach these for any rhyme or reason, but one thing's for sure, you don't want the end of your styrofoam to end up out in that open void. If it does happen, you can just cut a little piece of styrofoam off to kind of act like a joiner to connect the back side of two of your ends together. It's a bit of a pain, but you can do it. So that's why I want to work with these nice long strips, is it makes sure that I can actually connect from our support rod on the outside edge all the way around to the cup. And you'll see here, I'm just, as it dries, I keep adding more and more layers. With these bottom layers, it's really important to lock everything down with a lot of hot glue, as this is going to be the foundation, and we don't really want the foundation to be kind of floppy. That's the part where models are going to be bumping around a whole lot. You can see me here, I'm just kind of smushing the glue around and making sure that it gets underneath that styrofoam. It's important when adding a new strip of styrofoam to try and get it as close to the original strip as possible. Now, the reason we want to do this is because the closer we can get these strips together, the less cleanup work there's going to be later, and the more realistic things are going to look. Now, it's okay if you end up with a piece that hangs out a little bit farther. Just go ahead and glue it down and get it as close as you can, and then use your X-Acto knife to clip it off and then kind of smooth out any sharp edges. Again, this is going to help make things look a bit more natural. If you were to just leave it sharp and flat, it'll be pretty obvious that that is where a knife has cut the styrofoam. And so by kind of rounding it out a little bit like you saw me do there, it kind of helps it to blend in with all the hot wire foam cutting that we've already done. Now, things get a little bit tricky as we go up from here and start adding layers, as we have less and less to glue and attach onto, which is why the styrofoam cup and our little support here becomes so much more useful. If you're finding it hard to work with when it comes to adding more layers, perhaps maybe that edge is not providing enough purchase for you, or maybe your hot glue gun is quite hot and you're tired of getting glue all over your fingers, you could attach a few strips to the back wall just to give yourself some more scaffolding to kind of attach everything to. In my case, I actually end up sticking a few small scrap blocks that I know really aren't going to be good for anything just because of the types of cuts that I've put on them. And I know they'll just be good ways of helping to reinforce and strengthen this project. Now you can see me here, I'm going ahead and anywhere where I've got joins, meaning anywhere where two pieces of foam are butting up against each other, I'm going back in and trying to smooth out that connection a little bit. In a few cases there are some really bad ones and I do just end up filling them with hot glue, and those are kind of more obvious in our next few steps here, as we're going to start sanding once we get all the way up to the top. And the reason we're going to sand is it's going to give things more of a weathered appearance. However, hot glue doesn't really take to sandpaper very well, so trying to make sure things get as close together now and taking your time now is going to save yourself a lot of headache later for things that need to be fixed. Now I know I've cut to the end here and maybe you guys would have wanted to have seen me build the whole thing up, but trust me, it was just a lot of the same thing over and over and over again. It is literally what we have already talked about, just repeated, I don't know, 50, 60 times, maybe more than that. Right now I'm just smoothing out the top. I did a bad job at picking where I put my camera, I'm sorry. I'm smoothing out the top because we're going to be making an end cap. Now normally I would take my time, I would smooth out the end cap a bit more than what we do, but I was getting toward the end of my allotted time for working on this project, thanks to a large commission that kind of set me back on making this video. So I kind of rushed through this a little bit. If I were to do this again, I would probably chop this down and maybe cut it in half. But I'm basically just going to go ahead and do the same thing we did to make all our little strips, and we're basically making our end cap that's going to close off our cup so we can't see it anymore, and it's going to close off any of the open-endedness that we have and hide all of that scaffolding and kind of get rid of all that. Now this is a little bit tricky, so you may want to cut out the rough shape of the piece and then glue it in place and cut it down once it's on the miniature. In my case, I did my best to cut it down before I attached it to the miniature, and that was just because I was confident that I could get it very close. But I do highly recommend that if you're not confident in your skills, or if you've just purchased your hot knife and you're not 100% sure if you're going to be able to get it perfect, go ahead and make it a little bit larger than you think you need, glue it down, and then go back in with your hot knife and carve it down and make it fit a bit better. I mentioned earlier in the video how important it is to try and make sure there's as few gaps as possible. This is why. I try to fill in as much of the larger gaps as I can with hot glue. I don't go all the way to the surface though. I try to leave a little bit of a gap, and that's because I always try to use something like plaster or perhaps wall spackle if I have it available to do the finishing touches on any large gaps, at least for terrain, because it helps to make it nice and rock solid, but it also helps it to look more like rock, since plaster kind of dries like the texture of rock. So I use a lot of plaster for terrain just to kind of fill large gaps, and we'll see more of that here in just a second. Now here you can see me on some of these larger gaps. I'm just going ahead and pushing some of this wall spackle, or in my case plaster, into these bigger gaps. Now I have mixed my plaster up a little bit on the thick side so it acts more like spackle, and I'm just going to go ahead and mush that into all the cracks. Now the reason we're doing this with this product instead of using something like Milliput or using something like green stuff is you're going to go through a lot of it on terrain, and I do end up using a little bit of Milliput later on for some bigger holes that I just couldn't fill with the plaster, but if I had done this all with Milliput, I would have used an insane amount of Milliput and it would have been very expensive. So we're using plaster just because it is so cheap for what it is. I mean, you can buy so much plaster for like 10 bucks. It's insane, and it'll last you a long time. And once again, we're just filling some of these larger voids that the hot glue just couldn't fill. At a certain point, when you start pumping enough hot glue into something like this, it just keeps the glue runny and you can't really fill the void. So if you're running into that issue, stop adding hot glue, switch over to plaster. You're gonna have a better time. You can see I'm literally spoon feeding the plaster into this crack, but it's doing just fine so long as I keep the mixture nice and thick, and that's easy enough. You just don't add as much water as what's recommended in the instructions, and it does cook off a little bit faster and allows you to start working with it a lot sooner. Now, one of the downsides to working with plaster is it does leave a bit of a rough texture, so we do have to go ahead and hit this with some sandpaper. I am using 3000 grit sandpaper. I'm not trying to get a polished finish. I'm just trying to knock off all the high spots and take down anything that might feel sharp when you're touching it. Remember, we're trying to make this feel like weathered rock, so it's okay if it's got some pits in places, so long as it's just not super sharp. Now you'll also see that there are a few places, like I said earlier in the video, I do end up using some modeling putty to fill some larger gaps, and that was just because I could not get around it because I didn't spend the time to make sure I sealed everything up properly. Again, I started stressing out, not sure if I could get the video done on time, and I just kind of started skipping steps and figured, well, I can always fix it later. Now I'm having to fix it. And if I had just taken the time when I was building it originally, I wouldn't be having to take the time now. So, lesson learned the hard way. Even I make mistakes, especially when I already knew what I was doing, and I knew I was making the mistake at the time, but I chose to do it anyway. Sometimes you just gotta learn them the hard way. Now, because this is a styrofoam build, we want to protect it as best as we can, especially if you plan to use spray paints on this thing. You are going to want to seal it as best as you can. My recommendation is the Blackmagic Craft Way. Essentially, this is Mod Podge with some black paint put in it. I know mine looks gray. If I'd put more paint in it, it would have been a lot darker. If I do 2 to 3 passes, it actually comes out pretty black. But honestly, the gray does well enough for me to be able to tell where I've got some problem spots so that I can fix it before I get too much Mod Podge on there. So I tend to like mine a little bit more on the gray side. But yeah, we just want to go ahead and get some Mod Podge all over the styrofoam, all over the plaster, all over the Milliput, and we just want to get this whole thing covered, sealed up good and tight, and as soon as it's dry, we can start painting. Now, you don't want to use your good hobby paints when we work on terrain, so I'm just using some Apple Barrel craft paints. This is Apple Barrel Khaki. I believe they still make this color. And I'm going to be applying mine with an airbrush. You could do a nice overbrush. You don't want to completely get rid of all of the grays. at least not all over. It's going to help to add some definition, and it's going to help to add some shadows without us having to go super crazy with the washes. Now the washes can be applied by hand. Again, I'm going to be doing mine with the airbrush. You'll see why very shortly. It helps us to do a lot of really nice thin controlled layers, and it gets us more of a Grand Canyon-y type appearance, where if you were to just put it on by hand, it'll look more like minerals in the rock, and you may want to do a heavy dry brush on top of it. Because this video is inspired by a comment that I got on TikTok during a live stream, this was in relation to them seeing some of my desert terrain, I wanted to go ahead and try and match that original paint scheme as best as I could, which is why we're going for a real Grand Canyon type feel. Now, in my opinion, the best way to get the Grand Canyon type feel is with these colors here. We're going to be using Agrax Earthshade Gloss, we're going to be using Karaberg Crimson, Fugan Orange, and Reichland Flesh Shade. Now there are a whole bunch of other colors that would work really great here as well, like Seraphim Sepia. However, with us starting with a khaki tone instead of more of a bone-like color, the Seraphim Sepia is just going to kind of get lost. So we don't need to really worry about that. Now I am speeding the video up a little bit, but really all I'm doing here is I'm applying some nice thin layers of the wash. Now if you want to get a similar effect but you don't have an airbrush, what you can do is you can cut your washes down with a little bit of glaze medium, or if you don't want to go out and buy glaze medium but you have contrast medium already, you can use contrast medium and you can get a nice thin consistency. Now, I'm not really picking any particular line to turn into any one color, but the one thing I'm trying to do is make sure that I don't put two of the same color right next to each other. So if I do orange in one location, I'm not going to immediately put orange above it or below it. I'm going to skip 2 or 3 segments, and then I'm going to put some more orange there. And then I'm also going to go back in with all of my other colors. So the trick here is definitely making sure you don't end up with 2 colors right next to each other. However, with the Agrax Earthshade, we are going to do a little bit all over. So in places where we don't put any colors, that's where we're going to go a little heavier with the Agrax Earthshade, and we're going to put the Agrax Earthshade on everything else, but we're not going to go super heavy on places that already have color. This is just to make things look a little bit more dirty and make everything kind of blend together. Now, whether you want to add any kind of basing material, whether it be something like a fine-grained sand, or you want to go ahead and add some grass tufts, that's entirely up to you. At this point, it's great to go on the table and it's going to look fine just the way it is, or you can put a little bit more work in. Well guys, for as unorganized of a mess as this week's video felt like making, hopefully you guys learned something interesting, and hopefully you guys agree with me that the second method is kind of the superior way of doing it. Although the first way is very easy, you do waste a lot of materials doing it that way, and even if you were to cut a hole out in some way, shape, or form, you still end up with a lot of wastage that way. So hopefully you guys understand that although it's a bit of a pain to do it the second way by cutting out the strips and gluing all the strips together, that you will get more terrain and it is worth the extra effort in the long run. Also, hopefully you guys learn from my mistakes and you take your time when gluing everything together so you don't have to do as much fixing in the end. As you can tell, most of my problems were at the top, which means I was running out of steam and starting to burn out on this project, and I just got sloppy. And sometimes when you recognize that you're doing that, it's just time to walk away, let it sit for the rest of the day, do something else, come back to it tomorrow. In any case, guys, that's going to wrap this video up. The miniature that we worked on today doesn't really fit on the round table, which is why we're not ending the video as we usually would. That's why I had all the images, so hopefully you guys are okay with that. Otherwise, I will try to find some way to make that work in the future. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support across all social media. That has been astounding. Thank you guys so much for searching me out and finding me elsewhere. As well as for those of you who have checked out the Patreon, I know that it's a little bit lacking. I don't always post to it as often as I should, which I suspect is why we only have one current subscriber. However, if there are certain things that you guys would like to see, or perhaps even changing the dollar amount for that rank, let me know and I will definitely consider changing those things and making sure that it is more enticing in the future. In any case, thank you guys so much for all the love and support. Genuinely, like, it's super exciting for me because we are right on the verge of 1,000 subscribers. 1,000 is a big milestone for a small channel. This is the turning point where things start to pick up pace, and I am excited to see what comes. So thank you guys so much for being here on this journey with me, and thank you guys so much for interacting with me in the chat down below. I really appreciate all the feedback you guys have given me. In any case, thank you guys so much for watching. May your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty.